Good evening and welcome to our Treasury of Massachusetts House Museums. We're going to take a tour. It's nice to get out of the house, and we're doing it the perfect way with a glass of wine and our feet up. My name is Catherine Allgore. I'm the president here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. We were the first historical society in the nation, and with our 14 million item and counting collection, including 2.5 presidential libraries, we're one of the most preeminent. But let's get started. No need to put on your coats. Gavin, introduce us in.
Thank you, Catherine. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to everyone who's joining us this evening. My name is Gavin Cleespees. I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a special welcome to anyone who might be joining a MHS virtual program for the first time. We hold an amazing collection of close to 14 million manuscripts, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents. We make our collections available to researchers and to the public for free and maintain an active schedule of programs for educators, academics, and the public at large. In these days of social distancing, we have taken to hosting virtual events, and we have online events planned for the rest of the calendar year. These include the 3-part series that this evening's program is a part of that will look at a sampling of local history sites. Tonight, we'll explore house museums, which is a topic close to my heart since I've run 2 house museums in my career. I can say that house museums include some really amazing institutions, but also face a number of challenges. Next week, we'll look at museums made from authors' houses, and in 2 weeks, we will look at hidden gems of local history. In this series of tours, we will be guided by Bill Hosley. Mr. Hosley has worked in public history for many years and is passionate about the value of local institutions. He has been a curator at the Wadsworth Atheneum, the executive director of both the Connecticut Landmarks and the New Haven Museum, and for the past 16 years has run Terra Firma Northeast, a cultural resource, marketing and development consulting firm. I hope you'll consider joining us for the following programs in this series, or check out all of our events on our calendar, including seminars, brown bag lunch talks, and teacher workshops. And then just finally, I would remind you that we make our collections and our online programs available for free, but we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members. If you are not a member or a supporter of MHS, I hope you'll consider joining so that we can continue our work. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Bill Hosley.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is terribly exciting for me. The public work of history starts often at the local level, and as Gavin mentioned, this has been a passion project for some years, is raising the visibility of our wonderful network of community-based historical societies and house museums. So let's have a look. Greetings and welcome to a Treasury of Massachusetts House Museums and Historical Organizations, a joint venture between me, Bill Hosley, and my Housing Our History Facebook site, Mass Historical. Too rarely said, but house museums and historical organizations are by far the largest segment of the museum industry. There are thousands, and thousands are amazing, some more than others. The sector struggles. Many organizations are poor, and almost everything in the current form of philanthropy and public agency grant support is kind of aligned against them. Collectively, however, they are nothing short of a civic miracle. In 2002, encouraged by the National Trust's marketing department, Trust CEO Richard Moe launched the Too Many House Museums movement. You can check out my YouTube channel for more details, but my sense from day one is that this campaign was a little clueless and opportunistic. There was rarely a hint that the champions of the Too Many movement get out much or have seen even 5% of what a place like Massachusetts has to show for itself. Collectively, these sites are nothing short of amazing. Then in 2014, Ruth Graham at the Boston Globe became the first journalist in America to welcome a dissenting point of view, which me in this case, to the table to make an advocacy argument. Here we are 6 years later with this 3-part series of webinars on mass house museums and historical. and historicals. And let's face it, there is no better place in the US to do this, because not only does Massachusetts have the most per capita, but they are among the pioneers and originators of the genre. As a little background, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now Historic New England, was added as early as 1909 with a charismatic visionary founder, William Sumner Appleton. The idea spread, and over time, Historic New England amassed a renowned network of astonishing house museums. At Historic New England, they come in various types. Famously, the late Abbott Lowell Cummings and Richard Nylander's restoration of the Harrison Gray Otis House in the 1960s wrote the book on painstakingly documented restoration and furnishing. They have other sites like Beauport and Gloucester that are time capsules of epic stature, the rarest and most precious thing in museumdom, slice of life realities preserved, staggering interpretive potential. Their Josiah Quincy House is a time capsule from the 19th century, a palimpsest with layer upon layer of family history, perhaps the rarest and most precious thing of all, recently given a state-of-the-art restoration aimed at intensifying and clarifying the very qualities that make it special. Historic Deerfield has a chain of state-of-the-art restorations, plus the fabulous Flint Center for changing exhibitions and deep dives into relevant material. None of this is new. Since 1909, Paul Revere's house has been a public treasure and long one of the star attractions on Boston's Freedom Trail. Nearby is the Boston African American National History Site, housed not in a residence, but in the 1806 African Meetinghouse on Beacon Hill. President John Adams' Peacefield, a National Park Service house museum, is a time capsule, not a restoration, almost unheard of among presidential sites. Another amazing palimpsest is the Jonathan Fairbanks House in Dedham, a house museum since 1905 and thus one of the first in Massachusetts, but also the oldest house in the United States, a national treasure. Of course, it's not just colonial period houses, but some great 19th and 20th century houses. The Gibson House in Boston, shown here, another time capsule. Mass Historical has stepped out with programming, on-site exhibitions, and the kind of scholarship that brings house museums and their stories to life. The Housing Our History Facebook community since 2011 has posted hundreds of reviews of house museums and historical societies and thousands of photos. It's a forum for issues like the tragic and unnecessary loss of the American Textile Museum in Lowell, about which I will not say more. The Mass History Alliance represents a rising tide of advocacy. Why it matters? Harvard professor Robert Putnam, in his sequel to the famous Bowling Alone, argues that our nation has had multiple pendulum swings between being me-centered and we-centered. We are at the end of a me-centered cycle that began in the 1960s. Getting from me to we is going to take massive infusions of civic attachment. What better place to begin than by embracing Learn Local in all its degrees, bringing the power of local history into the classroom. So let's hear from our fabulous guests. First, Lauren McCormack from the...
So I'll just bring my screen up, and while I do so, I certainly do want to thank Bill for having us here and for the Mass Historical Society. It is quite an honor. So as Bill mentioned, my name is Lauren McCormack. I'm the executive director of the Marblehead Museum. The museum was founded in 1898 as the Marblehead Historical Society. And over the years, we have acquired 3 buildings in town, 3 different museums, but certainly our jewel in our crown is the Jeremiah Lee Mansion, which you can see here from an aerial shot. And it is an exquisite building. It was started in 1766 and completed in 1768. And what you see, the main building that you see there is just part of the property. And Jeremiah Lee certainly had started earlier on buying up parcels of property and even taking down existing houses to develop his one set piece. And what's great about this building is that it is right smack in downtown historic Marblehead. And for those of you who have not been there, I really encourage you to come to see the town, because it has one of the largest concentrations of pre-Revolutionary War structures in New England. And so being right in the middle of that, when you step outside the door of the Lee Mansion, you're seeing some of the very same buildings that Jeremiah Lee would have seen when he stepped outside his door over 250 years ago. It's just quite astounding. And as you can see, it is quite an astounding building as well. What you're seeing here is rusticated siding. It is not actually granite. We get a lot of questions. Is that stone? It is wood, and very much like Mount Vernon, a much more well-known example of rusticated siding. It is wood blocks cut to look like stone, painted, and then sand blown onto the stone. So even today, if you come, you can feel a little bit of the sand still there on the facade and on the rear of the building, and you can get a sense for that stone texture that they were looking for. This is a digital rendering that was done a few years ago of what we believe the building looked like in 1768. And as you can see from the previous slide, not much has changed about it, which is wonderful. The balustrade did disappear in the mid-19th century. And of course, the landscaping is different. But overall, it is very much the same building as it was when Jeremiah Lee had it built in 1768. And it is a wonderful example of Georgian architecture. For those of you familiar with the design books of the day, you will recognize this building, and you will recognize a lot of the decorative details that you'll see as we go inside. And to give you a sense, it looks massive, and it is in fact 18 rooms, 3 floors, plus the cupola on top. Almost every room has a fireplace and a closet, which is rather unusual. And actually, when you come to see the Jeremiah Lee Mansion today, you will get a tour of all 3 floors, and almost every room is on the tour. Not necessarily during COVID times, but during normal times, that is the case, certainly. And just to show you, this is Jeremiah and Martha Lee. He was a merchant, one of the wealthiest men in the colony, according to the 1771 tax records. Wealthy enough, certainly, to have these amazing paintings, full-length portraits done by John Singleton Copley in 1769. They still exist. They're in the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Supposedly, Copley only did about 9 full lengths, and these are 2 of them. So that just kind of gives you a sense of Jeremiah Lee. He made his money in the mercantile industry, or as a merchant, I should say. And this house is meant to impress. So when you walk in the front door, today even, and probably even more so in 1768, people walk in and they just say, wow, this is pretty amazing. Double wide stair, very high ceilings, an open landing halfway up, and the mahogany woodwork that you see all around there is just fabulous. And again, I mentioned the design book. So here is a piece, the overmantel and the fireplace surround, directly out of Abraham Swan's 1745 British architect. Just a wonderful wood carving. And originally this room would have been a nice light stone, yellow stone color. And you can just imagine it walking in, say in the evening with a fire going or the candles lit, the light reflecting off mirrors across the way between the windows. And it just, the atmosphere would have been amazing, quite elegant. And certainly Jeremiah Lee did not worry about spending money. There are amazing details throughout the entire building that just add a little extra, even when you don't expect it. And even some of the 3rd floor chambers, the details are quite exquisite. But I would say the piece de resistance of the building are the original 1768 hand-painted wallpaper that was done in England to the specifications of the Lee mansion and shipped over and installed in the mansion. And it's in the entire first floor as you go up the stairs, and in these two second floor rooms. And they're just fabulous. It's the only hand painted English wallpaper that still exists on its original walls in its original place. You may be familiar with the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Van Rensselaer room that has similar wallpaper, but these are still on the very same walls. It's just quite amazing. And you can see they represent all different scenes, classical scenes that were very popular at the time. And certainly we are extremely lucky that they have survived all these years. They have been preserved in various ways over the years. In fact, in the 90s, when some of the pieces were pulled off the wall to be backed, to be lined, to preserve them, we even found the original tax stamp, which is just fabulous to have as well. Now, the Jeremiah Lee's story in and of itself is fascinating. It's too much for me to go into detail right now. We just don't have the time. But he passes away in 1775, just as the Revolutionary War is starting, and he was very active in the war. And his wife lives on until 1792, and it takes almost that entire time for his estate to be finalized. When it is finalized, unfortunately, he's comes up insolvent. He owes more than he has or his estate has. So once Martha passes away and the widow's dower is no longer in place, the house changes hands a few times, mostly as an investment or a rental property. We're not entirely sure. Before it is sold in 1804 to the newly formed Marblehead Bank. And for the next 100 years, the mansion is a bank building. With that great hall with the amazing carvings was actually the banking room. And then there were offices, some rental spaces, and then the head cashier's family was allowed to live on the one side of the building. And so there's some great stories that come out of that. But for that 100 years, not too much was changed about the building, and aesthetically it stayed relatively the same as far as we can tell. But then the bank goes out of business in 1804. And in 1904, it starts to go out of business. They start to liquidate. And eventually in 1909, they put the mansion up for auction. And the story goes that an antique dealer from Boston was going to come in. He wanted to buy the Lee mansion. He wanted to disassemble the pieces of it and sell them off to collectors and other individuals around the country, perhaps the globe. And so Marblehead Historical Society, which is now the museum, and the citizens of Marblehead rallied together and they purchased the mansion in 1909. As you can see from this auction broadside that we have in our collection, the sale was June 23rd, 1909. By the middle of July, they were already giving tours of the mansion. So it has been open to the public for tours since 1909. Now, Bill's asked us to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges that we face as a historical or a history museum, a house museum, excuse me. And there are many and they are varied. And I will just sort of touch on a few of them and then also touch on some of the amazing possibilities we have coming up for us. Now, for whatever reason, Lee's papers don't survive. So as we are interpreting this space, we don't have a lot of documentary evidence about Lee, about his family, about his domestic or enslaved workers, nor do we know exactly how the house was used during his occupancy in particular. We actually have a little bit more information about the 19th century than we do about the 18th century. And probably owing to Lee's insolvency, very few of his personal belongings have survived. Not as many things passed down in the family as you might think. And certainly we know that by the time we have Jeremiah Lee's inventory, probate inventory from 1775, and then we have Martha's from 1792, and she is living in far reduced circumstances by that time. So not as many artifacts to display. So what you're seeing, and what, as I mentioned, you see most of the mansion when you come on a tour. what you're seeing is the things that the Historical Society has been gifted or purchased over the last 120 years. So in some senses, there are places where the Lee Mansion serves as open storage or collection storage, because we just don't have the space to store everything. And that, I think, in all honesty, affects the interpretation of the building, because it isn't all one thing or all the other. There's some disparity throughout, to be absolutely honest with you. Like most museums, and Bill mentioned this, certainly, we are a small staff with a small budget. We have 2 full-time, 3 very part-time staff. And we are so dependent and grateful to our volunteers who lead our tours. Some of them have been leading tours longer than I have been alive. I'm not going to tell you how long that is. You'll have to determine that for yourself. But so some people have been giving the same tour for that whole time, and how we have learned how museum interpretation can change and should change over time. And so working with the volunteers who we're so grateful to and dependent upon allows us to keep the mansion open, but does pose its own challenges. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly mention a few of our prospects and possibilities. We have so many opportunities to reinterpret the spaces, to look with different lenses at different people at different time periods. And it's a challenge that we certainly need to undertake, and to not rely on the old sort of colonial revival look to the mansion, to the furnishing plan, to the interpretation plans, and take advantage of it. Certainly take advantage of the opportunities that are upcoming, like Rev 250 certainly is, we hope to be very much a part of. And one thing I just want to quickly mention before I stop that I'm particularly excited about is, to the right of the building, you'll notice this brick building here, to the right of the Lee Mansion. In the deeds and the paperwork that we have, this is referred to as the bakehouse, Lee's Bakehouse. But for more than 150 years in town, it's also been referred to in town lore, if you will, as Lee's slave quarters. And so we really need to start looking at that, and to start thinking about how we interpret a 360-degree look at the family and the workers who inhabited the building, who worked in the building. And so I hope this is work that we have started, that we will continue on. We do not own this building, the slave quarters, but we want to make it part of our interpretation. So that's just a little snippet, and I encourage you please to all come visit us. We'll open again in June, and we're open June through October. You can learn more on our website, and I very much appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Lauren. And, you know, as you put it, Marblehead is just a spectacular destination. And in my intro, I used this funny word, palimpsest, which you can look it up, but it's layers and layers and layers. And that's what makes a place special, when you can see history as this succeeding generations of content on the ground and right in front of you, and it's what makes Marblehead special. But that house is so amazing, and good luck with the slave quarters and a variety of future opportunities. Susan, I already introduced you, or at least I introduced the Mayflower, but let's get right to it. The Plymouth, you know, this COVID has obviously thrown a curveball at Plymouth 2020, so we'll hear a bit about that. But Plymouth, Mass is another one of these spectacular destinations with layers of history. So let's hear from Susan Belekowitz.
Welcome. I'm Susan Belekowitz, Executive Director of the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, also known as the Mayflower Society. It's my pleasure to introduce Governor General Jane Hurt, the 35th Governor General. Jane also holds the distinction of being just the 5th woman to be elected to this position since our society's founding in 1897.
We thank you for the opportunity to allow us to share our 2 iconic landmarks in Plymouth, the Mayflower Society House and the Mayflower Meetinghouse. The Society's education mission is to tell the Mayflower story and its importance to the founding of America. The restoration and preservation of these two treasures helps us to continue to tell that story. With over 30,000 members, we welcome visitors year-round. Founded in 1897, the Mayflower Society has been headquartered in Massachusetts for over a century. This is our beautiful historic house museum, the Mayflower Society House. It overlooks Plymouth Harbor, the ship Mayflower, and the historic Plymouth Rock.
And now, former Governor General George Garmany will tell you about the Mayflower Society House's history.
First, to understand that the house was square. It was not white the way you see today. It was made of wood that was treated to look like stone. Then years later, they replaced and added stone features. Stone was regarded as a sign of the wealth and a status symbol for the house. But then in subsequent years, the house fell into disrepair. And during the 1930s, completely vacant. There was nobody living here. A strong woman named Adelaide Newell Meek, who was herself a member of the Mayflower Society, actually saved this house from being destroyed. She mounted a campaign to stop a demolition order that was placed on the house that would have converted this whole property into a parking lot, if you can imagine. And then in 1939, at the height of the Great Depression, the Mayflower Society began the steps that would allow to raise the funds and create the general support for the purchase of this house. That dream came true. The Mayflower Society purchased it within weeks of the bombing on Pearl Harbor. When the war broke out, when World War II broke out, the Society allowed the American Red Cross to use this facility free of charge throughout the time of the war years. Then after the war years, the Society began the restoration process to put the house in the form and the quality that you see today.
So George, what's the connection, or is there a connection to Mayflower Pilgrims?
Sure. The house was originally built in 1754 for Edward Winslow, who was the great-grandson of Pilgrim Edward Winslow. Originally, the house was much closer to the street. And then after the American Revolution, it passed through a number of families' hands, and eventually, at about the turn of the 20th century, it was bought by Charles Willoughby of Chicago. The Willoughbys envisioned this as a grand summer home. They engaged architect Joseph Everett Chandler to enlarge it, add a lot of the nice features, and move it 30 feet back from the road from where it had been before. And then after the Mayflower Society acquired it in the 1940s, it was opened to the public for tours. Come on in, let me show you around.
So George, what are some of your favorite stories about the Mayflower House?
One of my favorite stories involves Lydia Jackson, whose family owned the house at the time. She, right in this parlor, married the poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. She had met him at a lecture that he gave on transcendentalism right at the spot where the Mayflower Meetinghouse is today. Another interesting story that's particularly interesting to me because I'm a physician involves her brother. His name was Dr. Charles Jackson. He was one of the discoverers of the medical uses of ether. He used to conduct experiments on himself right here in this parlor. And the chair that he used is now at Pilgrim Hall Museum, just a few blocks from here.
Well, thank you, George. Those are great stories. And if you want to learn more great stories about the house, please come to America's hometown and come and take a tour. But right now, we're going to take a walk 2 blocks up the street to Town Square, where the Mayflower Meetinghouse is located. We are now in the sanctuary of the Mayflower Meetinghouse. The Meetinghouse was donated to the Society by the First Parish Unitarian Universalist Church during former Governor General Lee Filson's term in office. Lee has been instrumental in raising funds to restore this beautiful landmark. Lee, why is the Meetinghouse important to the Mayflower story?
Oh, well, Susan, the Mayflower story happened here. This is where it all began back in 1621 when they built their first meeting house. But since then, there have been 5 buildings. This is the 5th. And it was built literally as a memorial to the Pilgrims. So that makes it especially important. And now that it's going to be our education center, it allows us to tell the Mayflower story right where it happened.
So tell me about the history of the society with this building.
Well, the society's got a very good history with this building. They helped raise the money to build it. It was finished in 1898, or roundabouts. It took them 3 or 4 years to build it. The society helped raise the money for this building. They went to churches all over America asking them to give, and they did. Guess how much it cost to build it?
How much?
$9,000 for this beautiful landmark. It was $9,000. But at any rate, the member societies also did a lot more. For instance, they donated the Tiffany stained glass window. They also did the altar and the pulpit. They donated a lot to the building. Every time we come to Plymouth to open our Congress, it opens in this building. And so this is a very special place and a reverent place to Mayflower descendants.
So now tell us a little bit more about the restoration project.
Well, the restoration project was very important. The First Parish Church very sadly turned it over and donated it to the Mayflower Society because they simply they couldn't raise enough funding in order to save this building. And it literally was at the point of needing to be saved. The windows literally that we had replaced and redone, we couldn't put back in the structure because the structure wouldn't hold it. There were leaks everywhere. The roof was failing. And so it became very, very important for us to start immediately.
And so tell us how the project is progressing.
Well, that's a very good story. Right now, the exterior is completely finished, and it is finished because of the generosity of the town of Plymouth, who gave us Community Preservation Act funds in order to complete it. They gave us $2.618 million to do that, and it is done, and we're so grateful to them. And now it's our turn. We're now starting on the interior. We're starting to do everything that we can to get it ready, which will cost about another $10 million. We're doing a before and after in the sanctuary so donors can see that. We're adding an elevator for ADA accessibility. We're adding a new entrance, a gift shop, a new film, and then as we raise money, we'll continue finishing it in phases.
Well, this is so exciting, Lee. Thank you so much. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning about the General Society of Mayflower Descendants and 2 of the most beautiful historic landmarks in Plymouth. We hope you'll come to visit us soon in America's hometown. And now, a final word from Governor General Hurt.
Thank you for your time today. The Mayflower Pilgrims were the first to bring families to America. They wrote the Mayflower Compact. They maintained a half-century of peace with the neighboring Wampanoags. And our Thanksgiving holiday is a symbol of their harvest feast with the native tribe in 1621. We hope you'll come visit us soon in America's hometown. Remember, the Mayflower Pilgrims are America's family. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm back in the reel now. So just to finish up, Bill did ask us to share our thoughts about what is unique about our properties, as well as the challenges we face. In addition to being places for tourists to visit, what is unique about both the Mayflower Society House and the Mayflower Meetinghouse is that our members are repeat visitors nearly every year. We have some of the highest number of return visitors in the country. Plymouth is a very special place for our members to visit. As descendants of the Mayflower Pilgrims, when they come here, they are literally walking in the same places their ancestors walked. Our members have a keen interest in both properties. Another factor that is unique for us is the competition we face for docents. In Plymouth, there are many historic homes as well as Plymouth Patuxent museums. They all employ docents and reenactors. And I did use the word employ. We don't have volunteer docents down in Plymouth. We are fortunate that many of our docents have been with us for years. But recently, we've started a docent intern program and have begun recruiting docent interns from local colleges. Being a docent in a historic place is a great hands-on experience for history, art history, and even performing arts majors. And by having a mix of both younger and more seasoned docents, it helps us engage all generations of visitors. As for the challenges, the primary one that I'm sure we will all agree upon is the challenge of maintenance issues. Keeping up with historic properties is difficult enough, but keeping up with them on the New England waterfront is another matter completely. Ongoing repair is essential. The damage inside the Mayflower Meetinghouse is substantial, as you all saw in the video. Even though we face a multi-million-dollar restoration project, there's never been any doubt our members want to do it. The opportunity to restore the Mayflower Meetinghouse and create the Pilgrim Education Center in the heart of Plymouth's Town Square is extraordinarily important to our society, the town of Plymouth, and to the future of the Mayflower education mission. Recently, there was an upstairs leak and the ceiling of the library, the Mayflower Society House, collapsed. I don't have to tell any of you, just when you think you're ahead of historic home maintenance, something like this happens. We are consulting with a historic preservation firm now about restoring the ceiling. Bill also asked me to mention what is going on in Plymouth during 2020 and the 400th commemoration. Well, sadly, due to the coronavirus, our properties have been closed and all events have had to be postponed. Most events are being rescheduled for the same time in 2021. We are hopeful that the pandemic will be behind us soon and events will resume in 2021, because we'll really look forward to welcoming you back to America's hometown. I'd like to thank Bill and the Massachusetts Historical Society for including the Mayflower Society in the session this evening, and I'll be available to answer questions at the end of the program. Thank you.
Well, Susan, thank you so much. And what an honor to learn all this. The Mayflower Meetinghouse project is extraordinary. I've been there. The stained glass is just indescribably interesting. And I think, Mayflower, the Lineage Society is kind of an underreported story. The Mayflower Society, the DAR, the Colonial Dames really kick-started preservation in America in many ways and have done such an extraordinary job. So it really was an honor to have you involved in this. And we're now going to transition to a part of Massachusetts many of you may not know. In fact, Plainfield, Massachusetts, in the Highlands, an area between the Connecticut Valley and the Berkshires, is one of the smallest towns population-wise in the state of Massachusetts. And yet this Shaw Hudson House, which we're going to learn about, is a national treasure. And, I have a personal relationship because I wrote a thesis in college about Plainfield, Massachusetts, a collection of 200 letters written back and forth between these two women who one lived there and the other lived in Vermont where I was in school. And so it's a very special place. And so let's hear from Lori.
Hello, my name is Lori Austin, and I am a member of the Plainfield Historical Society. First, let me tell you a little bit about Plainfield since it is so out there. It was first settled in 1770, primarily by settlers from the town of Bridgewater, and was officially incorporated as a district within the town of Cummington in 1785, and as a town itself as on June 15th, 1807. In the 1800s, Plainfield was a thriving agricultural community, primarily producing sheep and leather for tanning. And with the widespread adoption of the steamship and the resolute globalization in the 1870s, the expense of importing both mutton and leather from Australia and New Zealand greatly reduced the need in town, and consequently the agricultural industries in Plainfield became much less profitable, and the population declined substantially over the following decades, many of the residents moving out west. And of course, at the time, west was like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. But after over a century, our population has begun to increase. Now we are up to a whopping almost 600 people in town here. We have a much larger population in the summer. We have a lot of summer residents that come in. We have a very diverse population. We have many farmers, but there's also lots of artists, authors, professors, gardeners, professionals, and of course we have a lot of amateur historians. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about the Shaw Hudson House. So here's a picture of the Shaw Hudson House. Dr. Samuel Shaw was Plainfield's eminent town physician in the early 1800s. He had begun his apprenticeship in the bordering town of Cummington with a fellow physician, Peter Bryant, who was the father of a well-known 19th century journalist and poet, William Cullen Bryant. Shaw married Peter Bryant's daughter, as a matter of fact, Sarah, and he both inherited the Bryant practice and early medical books, many which we still have in the house today. His wife unfortunately died very young, and when he remarried, he married Elizabeth Clark Shaw, and he built this house for her. The Shaw Hudson House was built in 1833, and inside the house it has the doctor's office. The next slide, please. And here's a picture of Dr. Shaw. He's and many of his family members are buried in our cemetery, Hilltop Cemetery, right here in Plainfield. Next slide, please. So the doctor's home office, it's really the crown jewel of the house, and it's been maintained just as it has during his whole lifetime. Dr. Shaw suffered an accident that impaired his mobility, and so his practice was mainly limited to his home office. Everything in this office was kept the same as he had it arranged, including this custom-made chair, wingback chair that sat next to his medical books. Apparently, he was quite a large man, so you can kind of see by that chair that it was really specially built for him. Upon his death, the house was taken care of by subsequent family members. Those relatives included his great-granddaughter, Clara Shaw Hudson, who was the last resident of the Hudson Shaw family to live in the house. She died in the 1960s, and she left the house to in a trust to the Plainfield Congregational Church. She also wrote a great book called Plain Tales from Plainfield, or The Way That Things Used to Be, with many anecdotes about this house. If you can please move to the next slide. So here's just a view of the Shaw Hudson House. So the entire house has been left exactly as she left it in the 1960s, with all of the original furniture and the rooms set up. But of course, the best part of it is this doctor's office. He literally walked out of the office, they closed it up, and it really has not been touched since. Next slide, please. So over the years, Mr. Hosley here has visited our house, helping the Plainfield Historical Society to piece together the history of this important home. Quoting him, he says, "There is nothing like this. If you want to get a sense of origins of the modern medical profession, it's a perfect snapshot of an emerging industry that needs to be preserved and promoted." The Shaw Hudson House, if it were in Old Deerfield or Salem, it would be one of the most important houses among those commodities. Though not operating as a house museum, the Plainfield home authenticity status ranks it with only a dozen others out of several hundred house museums in all of New England. It's a very rare thing to see. And like Mr. Hosley, we would like to see it become more of an active house museum. Right now, people are only visiting the house upon request. And I will talk later a little bit more about how we are using the house. Next slide, please. So the Shaw family had many important physicians in their family, and they all collected wonderful medical books, and we have many of their medical books in our collections. You can continue to the next slide. His apothecary here is just as he left it. If you open up the drawers in there, there is all kinds of interesting things in there, medicines, all kinds of minerals and chemicals and instruments to be used. It has not been touched since he left it. Next slide, please. So just some examples of some of the medicines that we find inside of his apothecary. Next slide, please. And as you can see, it's really a treasure trove. It's just quite amazing whenever you open these drawers to just find all this stuff untouched for hundreds of years. Next slide, please. We also have a lot of his, I don't know, recipes you might call them, the different medicines, the compounds that he would put together, different prescriptions that he wrote. So we have all of this in our archives too. Next slide, please. So one of the particularly interesting things about the Shaws was their connection with William Cullen Bryant and the Bryant family. So this is a picture of the Bryant homestead, which is about 5 or 6 miles down the hill from us. Right now, that is in the trustees of the reservations. And so one of our hopes is that somehow we could work together with the Bryant homestead to create tours of both buildings, because there's so many interconnections between the family members. Next slide, please. So to me, one of the most fascinating people that have connections with the Shaw family is Anna Laura Clark. Now, she was a sister of the second wife of Dr. Shaw. She was a teacher and lecturer at the time. She worked out of Northampton, Massachusetts. She opened a school first, and then she moved on to giving lectures all over the United States at the time, moving out to Ohio at one point. She was one of the first women to actually go on a lecture tour. And a professor, Granville Ganter, had done a whole article on her, and it is our hopes that we can do some more research on her. Next slide, please. Because in this house upstairs in an old trunk are dozens of what you see in front of you right now, and these are hand drawn by Anna Laura Clark. They are props that she would use while she was teaching, and so these particular ones are showing you timelines. She also did timelines of women's dresses, clothing throughout the ages, history, science, and she also had with her a lantern slides. And in historic Northampton currently has all of the lantern slides that she had. And she would just go around, and she actually made a living and actually supported the rest of her family by doing this. Next slide, please. Here's another example of one of these wonderful drawings that she did. They're all scrolls. They're currently upstairs in our attic. We have no idea how to preserve them, what to do with them. I am going to spend the winter trying to photograph all of them and put them in some kind of order. And it is our hope that maybe we can reach out to Historic Northampton and work with them on really saving and telling this very important story. Next slide, please. So while Anna Laura Clark was in Northampton, she also taught needlepoint, and so here is one of her actual needlepoints that she did. It's all done in silvers and golds. It's quite beautiful. We have a few of her paintings in the collection. Next slide, please. These are some of the old trunks up in the attic that were storing some of her scrolls. I would love to find out if one of them actually was hers and what the story is behind just these few pieces of history that we have. Next slide, please. So how are we using the Shaw Hudson House? Well, as I said, we are a all-volunteer historical society. We have a very limited budget, very, very small budget. So we use the Historical Society for our, the Shaw Hudson House for our Historical Society meetings. And here you see us socially distancing at one of our last meetings out in the back. Has a beautiful large yard out back and a couple of great barns that are attached. So we do use the barns to store some of our collections. The next slide, please. So just a couple weeks ago, we actually held an event, all socially distancing, of course. We had a local farmer come in with an oxen demonstration, and he gave us a very wonderful presentation on how oxen were used and might have been used actually building the Shaw Hudson House. Next slide, please. We have local artists. Here we have a local Michael Melly, who does local scarecrows. And so for May Day, he put up a beautiful maypole. Next slide, please. We've hosted dinner parties as fundraisers. So here is one part of the house inside. This is one of the rooms inside, and we are set up for a nice dinner. We can usually have dinners of about 25 people inside the house. So that was one of our biggest fundraisers until, of course, we got hit with the COVID. Next slide, please. We also have our annual meetings here. We always have a speaker at our annual meeting. This year we had Dennis Picard. Many of you might know who he is. He's a local historian, and he has been coming up the last few summers and picking out about 7 or 8 items out of our collection to research and teach us about. So here he is talking about a bucket that was from the Mountain Miller, who the Mountain Miller was a famous person who had a wonderful mill site that actually the Plainfield Historical Society owns currently. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that we face are many. We are entirely made up of volunteers. We have about 7 or 8 people that are kind of always the people that are doing most of the work. They're very devoted, and we do have some varying degrees of experience. Web design, I'm the person that puts together our web page, and I'm also the secretary. We have people that are doing research. Actually, we're all doing research. We have a stone masonry person who has been working on our mill site, post and beams construction, so we can consult with Richard Potter, who does that, photography, historical research, and grant writing. But we are challenged for time because most of us are all still working, and also, of course, the money constraint. Our biggest problem with the Shaw Hudson House in the past has been the fact that it is held under a trust through a local bank, Greenfield Savings Bank, through our local church. There was not a historical society at the time of the last descendant of the Shaws when she died, and so she left it to the church. This leads to difficulties in applying for grants to help maintain the property and to preserve many of the artifacts that are held in the house. Some are parts of the collection, and some of them are the Plainfield Historical Society. So in the house, you're going to see parts of the Historical Society's collection and parts of the Shaw Hudson House Trust collection. And sometimes it's very hard to tell. We're working right now putting together a database and an inventory on all of the artifacts and trying to sort through whose is whose and what is what. So that's been a challenge, and that's been what we've been spending a lot of time the last couple of years, right, is putting this together. Our point, we would love to develop an interpretive plan for this site, and Mr. Hosley has actually submitted one, and so we would love to be able to work with him in the future to somehow make the house much more accessible. As it is right now, as I said earlier, it's only open by appointment. We'd like to create a user-friendly illustrated guide, training manual to improve the ability of the Plainfield Historical Society to present the site in a compelling and consistent way. We'd like to develop a public program component to get mid-project feedback and community involvement. And we just have to fundraise and fundraise and fundraise. And when we're in such a small town and very few people know about this, this house, until the last maybe 20 years, was really kind of kept a secret. I know when I first got on the Historical Society, it was many of the members were afraid that if we put things out there and told people what we had in this house, that we would be jeopardizing it. So right now we're really looking to go the opposite way and open this house up and let people see what a wonderful thing we have in our small little town. Last slide, please. And so if you want to learn more about this house or more about the Plainfield Historical Society, we have a website. And this is kind of an aerial view of the town. As you can see, it's a very, very small town. So thank you for your time. Thank you for highlighting us. We really need all the help we can get. So thanks.
Well, thanks to all of our presenters. I think you all have told some wonderful stories about some wonderful locations around Massachusetts, and I do hope once COVID is over, we're all able to visit in person, but at least now we're able to visit virtually, or at least take a little bit of a tour. So we have a couple questions from the audience. So seeing that it's 6:27, we probably won't be able to get to too many of them. But the first one, I believe, is to Lauren. And the person, to paraphrase, said that they understood the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford is the only confirmed slave quarter structure in the Northeast. And they were curious as to how much you knew about the brick house to the right of the Jeremiah Lee house actually having been slave quarters or the home of enslaved people. And I think that that also ties in, just to add a little bit of my own question, to a larger question, which is, you know, typically one of the limitations of house museums is that the prominent wealthy houses are preserved. And it's very rare to find homes of African Americans who lived in places like Massachusetts. But of course, there were African Americans living here, but it's much harder to document that. So you obviously can speak specifically to the building next to yours, but if you also have thoughts on the broader question, you're welcome to share them or not.
Absolutely, thank you, and a great question, Gavin, and to the person who sent that in. Yes, the Royal House is currently, says that they are the only house with the attached slave quarters, and and that's a conversation that I'd like to have with them, because what kind of documentation can be found? Sometimes, what we have are the deeds. We have other types of documents that refer to it in a particular way by the usage of the house. I mentioned a bakehouse, and without owning the property and being able to get in and maybe doing some archaeological work, there are a little bit of limitations. It's been in a private owner situation for quite a long time. That being said, I think what's even more important is that we as an institution, and we do represent not just this one building, but the town history in general, because we are the museum for the entire town, is to examine the lives of individuals, people of color, indigenous people that haven't been as closely studied or as brought to life as much as the rich white men and their families have been, as we certainly know. And so that is a broader conversation that we've been having for a couple of years now, and research projects are underway to identify people and to share those stories, and not just to come from us, but to join with other community organizations, so that we're seen as we want to become a community resource in very many ways. And one way is by helping teachers, helping other organizations in town. We have a Racial Justice League, we have a Task Force Against Discrimination, and all moving together to learn more and then to share these stories. It's so important, I think.
Well, part of the excitement of the whole history field is that it's always growing and evolving. I mean, it's interesting that Plymouth Plantation changed their name, and the Native history and the Wampanoag history, we're learning so much. Just this past week, Historic Deerfield published this amazing magazine, a booklet really about the Native history of the Connecticut Valley. So there's when you drill down into a subject, you learn things. And I think that one of the revolutions that's happening now is that wider expanse of curiosity that is endless once you get started.
So we also had a question from, which is, I think, from a person named Lori, which I think is a good question for any historical house museum. But I think maybe Susan, since you mentioned that you have many repeat visitors, you might be a good person to tackle this first. But Lori wrote, these tours of individual houses are delightful as well as fascinating. I'm interested in how these museums have or plan to keep these museums vibrant and relevant as we move forward in time. How does a museum keep new and interested visitors informed and drawn in? And I know, having worked in a house museum, 2 house museums, if your house museum is a fabulous representation of a specific time, it's hard for it to change. So I think that's a common problem. So I don't know if you'd like to tackle that, Susan, or not.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's very true, Gavin, what the opportunity we have at the Mayflower Society House versus the opportunity that we have at the Mayflower Meeting House. At the Society House, there is a story that is told, and it's the history of the house and all of the people who have lived there. And so to a point, it's always going to be that story. But there are a lot of creative approaches that people in the house museum business are doing now, like having reenactments, have an event where you have a reenactment of Ralph Waldo Emerson marrying Lydia Jackson at the house. I mean, there's all kinds of more creative things that I think are possible that we could incorporate into our programming. But really, the Mayflower Meeting House lends itself to being able for us to tell the Pilgrim story in a way that the society really never has had the opportunity to before. And we certainly envision to have changing exhibits and other things to keep it interesting and keep it fresh so people want to keep coming back again and again. I mean, I think we are very fortunate that our membership is so enamored with Plymouth and they come back every moment they can. So we kind of have a built-in audience in that regard, but truthfully, our hope is to engage the public in the Pilgrim education story as well. So I hope that helps.
And I think that we probably only have time for one last question, and I know that we're running a little over time. But Rachel wrote, I would love to hear the presenters discuss where they obtain their funding to keep these houses going. My Historical Society board has an exciting opportunity to purchase a historic home, but there's doubt about how it will be funded with limited resources. And I think that that's sort of an interesting cross-section here, because I think Lori and Susan are probably at slightly different ends of the spectrum in terms of operations. So, but I think everyone is facing a challenge like this, no matter where they fall on the spectrum. So I don't know, Lori, if you have any suggestions or if anyone else would like to jump in.
Right now, the only funds we get are from membership dues. We do have our website, which is kind of active and people make donations. When we do a fundraiser, we do a pie bake. So we're only being able to fundraise hundreds of dollars at a time. And so that really has been a big issue for us, because some of the work that the house needs is going to take a lot more money than that. So currently, I can't really offer you anything other than if you're looking for great pies, come on up Memorial Day, because that's when we are auctioning them off.
Susan,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if either of the others have suggestions or Bill, go ahead.
Well, part of my criticism of the too many house museums movement is this notion that these places are static. And I've been a fan of these kinds of museums for 45 years, and there are exceptions, but the vast majority are better off than they were 10, 20, and 30 years ago. And it's sometimes the pace of progress seems glacial, but if you program effectively, if you do research, if you find those storylines, I love this idea that the Lee Mansion is looking into the slave quarter. There's so many dimensions to all of these sites. And actually with the Shaw Hudson, I mentioned women's history. There are elements of that house, because it is a time capsule that we didn't even get to in this, about the later generations of women that lived there. So if you do the research and program and promote effectively, people are engaged, and when they're engaged, they support. And when they support, some of them really fall in love, and in the end, they kind of sometimes leave you bequests and you build endowments. This is how it's done. And I think that I'm always optimistic and hopeful that the public work of local history is infinitely inspiring and has unlimited promise.
I think on that note, I think we'll probably let people go, because it is certainly time for many people's dinner. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming and sharing your evening and your time with us. And again, I hope that everyone is able to visit some of these museums once they have a chance. Catherine, did you want to say a farewell?
I wanted to thank our audience for sticking with us, and thank you all. And I think you've tempted all. I think you've got ticket buyers. We're ready. We're all ready to go. We're all ready to go. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.